Note: this story was dynamically reformatted for online reading convenience. Part 2. Brisket's Choice by Sol Oliver. George and Donna returned home with their android servant, Brisket, and were eager to work her into their daily lives. Only days before, the busted beauty had introduced herself to George in a big way as she followed instructions from his wife. It seemed to him that Brisket kept leering at him, as if to say, "I fucked your ass, didn't I?" But it was probably just in his mind. After that first night, he started to feel ashamed at having been taken by his schmo android. Looking over at him as they entered their house, Anna could tell that he was feeling humbled, and she liked it. After all his years of cheating, she had caught him fair and square. And if he was having second thoughts about keeping the wiener-wielding Brisket, he'd just have to tell her directly. In the meantime, she'd have some fun with him. "What do you want for dinner tonight?" asked Donna as they sat down in the living room. "Doesn't matter to me," said George, who was just glad to be home. As he sat with his wife on the couch, they watched as the statuesque android began unpacking their bags, making piles of clothes for the laundry. Anna noticed that George avoided looking at Brisket, particularly at her bulging flex. "How about sausage?" suggested Donna mischievously, licking her lips and making a yummy sound. George fidgeted and coughed. He knew he deserved the ridicule, but at the moment didn't want to think about the way the android's girl cock had invaded him. He was relieved when Brisket left the room, laundry in tow. "I think I'd rather have clams tonight," replied George as he slipped a hand up her dress and onto her thigh. Anna pushed him away playfully and slapped him lightly across the face. "You cad masher!" she cried as she dramatically fainted back onto the couch, one forearm to her forehead. As she leaned back, George noticed Anna's rock-hard candy nipples below her blouse. The game was on. As much as he had fooled around in the past, it was never because he didn't enjoy his wife. On the contrary, when he was near her, it was always hard for him to keep his hands off of her. And she had a playful nature that matched up well with his enthusiasm. "Stay right there, young lady, or you'll be in big trouble," said George, whose bladder wouldn't last through the rock that he and his wife were gearing up for. "If I stay, will you punish me anyway?" moaned Donna as she shot him her hungriest look and spread her legs open just enough for George to see her panties. "I'll eat you alive," said George, and Donna cocked her eyebrow with interest. George could smell his wife's distinct fragrance, and looked forward to driving her wild with his ministrations. For now, though, he just needed to pee. Shaking the last few drops free, he washed his hands and headed back into the hall and was nearly knocked over by a tall, busted woman carrying a basket full of laundry. "Whoa," said George, gathering his balance. "I'm sorry, sir," said Brisket, who had dropped the laundry. As she bent over to gather the fallen clothes, George couldn't help staring at her shapely ass, which was easily as nice as his wife's, if fuller. But he was unnerved again when she stood back up and the bulge appeared again at the front of her pants. Brisket noticed him staring, and once again it seemed to George that she was enjoying his discomfort. "Is there something I can't do for you, sir?" asked the beautiful servant. Before he could answer, a voice came from the living room. "Did you start without me, lover?" asked Donna in a sweet sing-song voice. "No, dear," shouted George. And then he had an idea. "I'll be there in a moment." George grabbed Brisket by the elbow and dragged her into the laundry room, out of Anna's earshot. The android scanned his face with a bland expression. "Are you programmed to give pleasure to Mrs. Luttrell?" asked George slyly. Now there was no mistaking the smile on Brisket's face. "I have not received specific instructions for Mrs. Luttrell's needs, but have the most comprehensive data set available for female recreational interaction," replied the android, whose eyes shone large and bright. She really was beautifully crafted, and George had to resist the urge to kiss her. He knew how she was programmed to handle his advances. Collecting himself, he continued his secret meeting with the robotic woman. "If I give you a set of instructions, will they act as programming?" asked George, hoping the answer would be yes. If it was, it would be payback time. "I can only be programmed through the Exila interface," said Brisket, This sounded like a no to George, and he slumped in disappointment. But after a pause, Brisket kept speaking. I can, however, follow any set of instructions. How is that different from programming? Asked George. If actions are programmed, I can conduct them with a certain amount of autonomy, said the blonde-headed android. Like the way you just started doing the laundry, said George with realization. Correct? But you can cooperate with me now. Was she leering again? Correct? Good. Here's what I want you to do. George returned to the living room after outlining his plan to Brisket, but Donna was gone. Looking around the room, he noticed her blouse had been cast onto the floor, on the way to the stairs. Halfway up the stairs was her skirt. Aha! She'd gone to the bedroom. George was reasonably certain that Brisket would still be able to carry out her part of the plan. He'd never said it had to be in the living room. As George headed down the hall to the bedroom, he saw on the floor the rest of his wife's clothes. The double doors to the bedroom were ajar, and he heard a quick rustling of sheets. George took a moment to undress himself and stepped inside. Anna had arranged herself on the bed in a seductive pose, one leg on top of the sheets. Her breasts were mostly covered, but there was enough flesh showing to keep his interest piqued. She watched George walk to the bed, licking her lips. George was already half hard, and she noticed. Eager today, aren't you? Teased Anna. George gave a playful growl and crawled onto the bed. He slid himself on top of his wife, enjoying the feel of her smooth thigh. They kissed deeply, bringing him to full erection. George moved the rest of the sheet aside with his body and began positioning himself to enter her. Ah ah ah, said Donna as she closed her legs. You were going to eat me alive, remember? George smiled and slid himself down her bare torso to her navel, kissing her along the way. Anna cooed and moaned, and she spread her legs wide apart. She'd been a figure skater all the way through college, and still had most of her flexibility. George grabbed her thighs and propped his head into position in front of her well-manicured bush. She was already wet and spread, her larger-than-average clit exposed from its hood. I just love seafood, said George as he dove into her warm flesh. Anna bucked at the first touch of his lips and shuddered as he worked his tongue along her crack. Climax began to swell up in her, but George eased up to keep her going. Oh, George, sighed Anna. You'd better finish me off. George didn't need to be asked twice, and in one motion he smoothly slid back up his wife's body, found her ready entrance, and eased inside. Owned Anna, whose recesses had been aching for his cock. It was like coming home to George, who immediately set to stroking. Anna's legs closed around his ass, and her arms held him tight around his back. Faster ... faster ... hissed Donna, who thrust back at him with each stroke. This would normally be when they would climax together, but today was a special day. George put himself all the way into her and stopped. George reached around Anna's back, hugging her, and rolled to his right. In a swift moment, Anna was now on top, George's cock still inside her. Anna's look of confusion was replaced by a smile, and she sat up. Why, George? It would be my pleasure. Still sitting up, Anna began to rock her hips slowly, enjoying the pulsing sensation as she moved George's cock inside of her. It took all of his concentration not to come, but his plan was about to come to fruition. If he knew Donna and he knew her quite well, she would close her eyes, quicken her pace, and lean over for more leverage. Sure enough, his wife's ass began to slide with more vigor. Her eyes closed, and she leaned down. Brisket had been watching from the bedroom door the whole time, being careful not to be seen by Mrs. Luttrell. Per instructions, she had stripped naked, and had watched with great interest as the man fucked his wife. Now a sequence of events was occurring that matched up with her instructions, and a feeling that the android had quickly grown to like was entering her loins. Brisket marveled for a moment as she watched her own thick penis rise, her processors going over the different ways to fulfill Mr. Luttrell's requests. Images flashed through her artificial consciousness. Thrusting, sliding, kissing. A powerful image entered her mind, Brisket pushing her android cock into Mrs. Luttrell's pussy, and the small woman reaching around to hug her, kiss her. In the nanosecond it took to appear, the image faded. It was not part of the instruction set. Another image flipped to her, the correct one, and Brisket strode to the bed, cock in the lead. "Oh, George!" George! Shouted Donna as she ground her pussy into him. As she rode him, George had watched the android appear in the doorway. She watched them with a mixture of curiosity and mischief. George couldn't help recall the other night as her 10-inch cock sprang to life, and was glad that it had a different target today. The robotic woman walked to the foot of the bed, crawled on, and paused. This was George's cue. "I want to try something," said George to his wife, who slowed her pace enough for her to listen. Brisket began to crawl forward, penis bobbing. Owned Anna. "You know I'll do anything for you." Anna looked into him with an expression of total adoration, and George almost felt bad for what he'd instructed Brisket to do. But it was too late for second thoughts. As he looked up, Brisket's sweet face appeared above Anna's, and then he felt the extra weight of the robotic body pressing down. "George," said a slightly panicked Anna. "What's going on?" Anna felt a smooth, slightly warmed weight on top of her, and two large, fleshy breasts pressed into her back. Blonde hair hung down over Anna's head, and she felt mechanical breath on her neck. "Brisket." Anna tried to lift off of George's cock, but the android's weight prevented her. Now there was a log sliding along her ass, spreading a viscous fluid. She stared down at George, who had a sheepish look on his face. "You didn't," said Donna as a bulb of flesh pressed at her anus. George grinned up at her. "Sorry, hon." The penis head began to slowly push into her rectum, and Donna made a ridiculous face as she sorted out the sensations. Burning. Fullness. Pussy throbbing from George's cock. The she-dick pressed forward, and Anna thought for sure something would split. But the pain receded as she grew accustomed to having the two cocks inside her. Sweating mightily, she began to grind into George again. George was relieved when his wife's face began to show strained pleasure. Hearing Brisket's cock slurp into her ass, he couldn't help but notice how much more slowly the android entered her than the way he'd taken it the other night. The android had her eyes closed now, and from the way he was being pressed into the bed, George could tell that she was moving the robotic organ in and out of his wife. "Oh!" "Oh!" cried Donna, who was feeling sensations she had never known. Brisket's giant tool was seeking out her most sensitive places using her back door, and finding them at a good rate. Strong waves began to crash over Donna, and she fucked onto George's cock to bring herself over the edge. "H!" shouted Donna, and George felt her clit push hard against his pubic bone. George let his lobe go into Donna, and felt an intense pleasure. With a long slurp, he heard Brisket's penis withdraw from his wife, her task complete. As George and Anna lay together in a heap on the bed, the android rolled off of them and lay still. Her cock stood straight in the air. After a moment, Anna rolled off of George and went to the bathroom to clean up. Now George lay in the bed with the servant android Brisket, whose artificial breathing made her breasts heave up and down. Small beads of artificial perspiration were gathered on her bosom and on her forehead. She was starting down at her chubby penis, which was still erect. George sat up. "You can put it down now, Brisket," said George. The cock remained as it was. I can't," said the android, who continued to stare at her road appendage. "The subroutine is keeping it in a turgid state." Brisket looked over at George with a hopeful look on her face, back to her cock, and then back to George. "Oh, no I won't," said George as he realized what Brisket wanted him to do. He sprang up from the bed, afraid that she would grab him. But Brisket just lay in the bed with a look of great frustration on her face. Her face pleaded. But her programming didn't allow her to ask anything of her owners, and she could not act on the impulses that her thought matrix was sending her. Enter the closest wormhole. "Can't you jerk off?" asked George. The curvaceous blonde with the throbbing hard-on frowned. but soon brought a hand to her unit. "Stop, Brisket," said Hannah, who had returned from the bathroom. Now she stood next to George, looking down at the perfectly formed bombshell who had her hard cock in her hand. Anna looked at George, a look of pity on her face. "You weren't going to make her jerk off, were you?" asked Anna. "She deserves better." "You're not serious, are you?" asked George. But it was clear that she was. "Well, I'm not going to suck that thing. I never leave you like that, do I?" "No, but nothing. It was your idea to bring her onto the bed." George looked down at Brisket, whose face looked like that of a dog who desperately wanted to go outside to pee. But George had only sucked it before because he was desperate. He'd feel foolish if he did it now. "Well, I wasn't the one who ordered the roba with a dick," he said. Anna rolled her eyes, shot him a dirty look, and crawled onto the bed. "What are you doing?" asked George. Now Brisket was smiling as the petite woman crawled to her. "If you're not going to do it, then I am," said Hannah, grabbing the she-cock with both hands. George was dumbfounded, and gawped as his wife took the whole 10-inch slab of girl meat into her mouth and throat. Brisket's eyes rolled back into her android head, her arms shot straight out, and she dug her hands into the bed. Anna's head bobbed up and down at Brisket's crotch, and as George viewed her from behind, he saw that she was working her cunt with one hand. George was getting hard again, and he crawled onto the bed. Anna's ass loomed before him, hot and wet. "Oh, no you don't," said Donna as she whipped her head around. With her other hand, George could see that she cradled Brisket's balls. "Aw, come on. I'm doing this as a favor for you, George," said Donna, turning back to finish off Brisket. Before she got her lips back onto the chunky organ, the android's hands stopped her. "What is it?" asked Anna. Brisket pointed behind her at George, who stood watching with a hard and then pointed at her own mouth. "Oh I see." Brisket smiled weakly, but was happy that the woman understood. It was against her protocol to express her own desires, but she was beginning to find ways around the edges of her programming. "What do you think, George?" asked Donna to her husband. "Think about what?" asked George, who hadn't seen their exchange of glances. Again Anna rolled her eyes. "If you like, Brisket will blow you." "Oh said George. This was unexpected. "That would be great. George got back onto the bed and crawled over to straddle Brisket's face, which began to register pleasure again. Anna had gone back to slurping on her girl meat. George brought his hard cock up to her mouth. Lowering it to her lips, Brisket surrounded it with precision. Her lips were pillowy and strong, and George almost fell over as she sucked his cock into her mouth. Keeping his tool in her mouth, she worked at it with her tongue, lips, and gums, and with surprising speed George found himself at orgasm. "Oh he shouted, loosening his cock into the android's mouth. The lips released, and he slid his penis out and lay down on the bed. Brisket's mouth was fixed in a silent O shape, and she gasped sharply as Anna's lips squeezed her cock head. George could see that his wife was quite worked up. In fact, he was certain that if he hadn't shot his load, she would have let him enter her despite her proclamation. As it was, he was quite spent. Donna mashed her hand into her hole as she furrowed her eyebrows and sucked Brisket's prick. No matter what she tried, she couldn't seem to make the android get off. Stroking, twisting, licking, flirting, ball licking. Nothing. She sat up and looked down at the blonde beauty. "I don't know if I can help you," said Donna, who prided herself on her oral skills. Brisket couldn't make demands or direct suggestions, but she was free to make observations. "Mrs. Luttrell, your vagina appears to be well lubricated," she said without emotion. Anna smiled, noticing for the first time how hard she was working her own organ. She looked over at her husband. "Honey?" she asked, and George knew that she would only do it if she had his okay. Since he himself was spent, it would have been cruel for him to say anything except yes. "Yeah, okay," he said. Brisket beamed, leaned over to him, and kissed him on the forehead. Then she looked up at Donna expectantly. "Just sit still," said Donna as she stood up on her knees. Moving her slit over the rigid girl cock, she slowly lowered herself down. Moaned Donna, enjoying the cock. George was the largest man she had ever had, but this girl's penis stretched her more. As she sank down onto the cock, she looked down at the beautiful blonde face. She looked angelic with her eyes closed, and she could hardly believe that this creature had such a splendid organ. Brisket opened her eyes and sighed. The large blue eyes were doing a wonderful imitation of affection, and at that moment Donna felt very close to the creature. She began to gyrate. "Ah! Ah!" cried Brisket, who had been close to orgasm for several minutes already. Donna stopped moving, sensing that the android didn't want to come yet. She herself wasn't far, either, and she leaned down for more leverage, like she had done so many times with George. Brisket's larger cock was putting more pressure on her clit than she was used to, and she gasped as her torso landed on top of Brisket's. Donna was amazed at the firmness of the woman's breasts. Too. The tingling feelings were bubbling up strong, and she ground her hips into Brisket, whose breathing came in short gasps. Together they bumped their organs together, until the feeling was too strong and the gates were thrown open. "Ah-ah-ah-ah-ah-h-h!" cried Brisket and Donna together. Donna collapsed onto Brisket's bosom, and could feel the penis deflate inside her. Then she remembered that George was on the bed too, and she felt guilty about how much pleasure she had felt giving head and fucking the well-hung woman. She leaned over and kissed him deeply on the lips. "Have fun, dear?" asked George, trying to sound casual. But Donna could tell that he was feeling insecure, and she slid off of the android and onto her husband. George could feel the artificial cum oozing from her twat. It was cold and slimy. Donna kissed him again and smoothed back his hair. He had believed in her when no one else had, and she would always love him for that. "You know you'll always be the only man for me," she said to her husband. George looked into his wife's eyes and saw everything that was good in the world. He smiled, and all was better. Both tired, and they closed their eyes. The android Brisket got up from the bed. Looking back down, she saw the gentlewoman nestled up against the man, both asleep. The man smiled, content in the glow of his woman's love. The woman also smiled in her sleep. But glancing down at her own dangling cock, Brisket thought she knew what had really made her happy. Turning from the couple, Brisket swaggered out the door to attend to her lady's household chores. George and Donna woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of sizzling meat. They both slept clear through the afternoon and evening, exhausted both from the trip home and the afternoon's exertions. Kissing each other good morning, they draped robes over each other's naked bodies and went downstairs, hand in hand, to the kitchen. George felt closer to Donna than he had in years. Their lovemaking had always been the most honest thing about their relationship, and they hadn't made love so well in years. Although he'd been a bit uneasy watching the well-equipped android take his wife the night before, he saw that Donna appreciated it. And Donna felt brand new. While her husband had never denied her any of her sexual desires, she appreciated the way he indulged her last night, and loved him all the more. She squeezed his hand as they entered the kitchen, and they both marveled at the sight. The tall blonde android was putting the finishing touches on breakfast. Eggs, waffles, a fruit salad, bacon, coffee, and juice were all laid out on the table. There were 2 place settings, and in front of each was a handwritten card with George and Anna's name. Brisket herself was at the stove, frying up what smelled like sausage. She had dressed herself in a pair of George's sweats, all of Anna's clothes being too small for the beauty. Despite the baggy wear, the splendor of her body was unmistakable. Her full, firm ass filled the pants nicely, and as she turned around to bring the sausages to the table, there was no mistaking the shape of her large breasts. The pants also did a poor job of disguising the bulge of her strange womanhood. George coughed. "Good morning," said Brisket to the couple as they sat down at either end of the table. Anna noticed that there were fresh flowers on the table, cut from the garden, and she smiled up at the android. "This was very thoughtful of you, Brisket," she said as Brisket filled their plates with the expertly prepared food. Anna knew that the robot was programmed to make breakfast, but neither she nor George had specifically asked her to. "It is my pleasure to serve you, Mrs. Luttrell," said Brisket, looking Anna straight in the eye. It made Anna feel slightly uneasy. The android's eyes and face weren't quite human, and it was sometimes difficult to read her expression, but Bunny had seen this look somewhere before. Brisket placed a large, chubby sausage link on her plate and smiled. "Enjoy," said Brisket, placing an identical link in front of George. Looking at the link, George noticed that it was fresh made, and was roughly 10 inches long. As Brisket poured him a cup of coffee, he again had the impression that she was leering at him. George and Donna finished their breakfast and talked about the upcoming week. George would only have to go into the office a few times for meetings, but could do most of his work from home. Anna had a similar schedule, the charity she worked for only needing her for 2 days that week. All in all, they were both ready for a week of little work and much love-making. Together they showered, caressing each other clean. As George ran his hands over his wife's breasts, he appreciated their perfect roundness and couldn't resist kissing them. One thing led to another, and their shower ended up taking a sloppy 20 minutes. Downstairs, Brisket could hear the moaning and screaming of the Luttrells fighting over the sound of the rushing water. Wiping the last dish dry, she pictured Anna's face as George made love to her, sliding his puny cock in and out of her beautiful body. The images were swept quickly from her thoughts, and she finished cleaning the kitchen with dull contentment. Clean and dressed, George and Donna came downstairs. Both of them needed to check in at their respective offices, and while they were a little nervous about leaving Brisket in the house alone for the first time, they didn't think it would be a problem. They also decided to meet at the mall later in the afternoon to buy some clothes for their servant. "Brisket, we're leaving," shouted Donna from the front door. The android quickly came to the foyer to see them off. "What time will you be returning?" "We should be home by 6, replied Anna. "Very good, ma'am," said Brisket politely before turning to begin her programmed chores. Anna and George watched her go, and it seemed to George that his wife's eyes were fixed on the android's ass. Anna noticed that George was giving her a funny look. "What?" she said teasingly. "She's already fucked me, so I may as well look at her butt." George blushed at his wife's frankness, which disarmed him completely. Anna slapped him hard on the ass and opened the door. "I still like your ass the best," she said, gesturing for him to walk outside to his car. George bowed to her theatrically and headed down the sidewalk. Glancing back into the house one more time, Anna followed. Neither George or Donna had much to do at work, and they were able to meet in the early afternoon. From shop to shop they drifted, seeking the best clothes for Brisket. They had her exact size from her specifications, which made it easy to find items that would fit, but it took a while to find the right outfits. Anna did most of the selecting, with George suggesting an occasional garment. They came away with 2 sundresses, 2 pair of jeans, several blouses, skirts, and stockings. Anna picked out her shoes, and George found her a robe and slippers. As they passed Victoria's Secret, the couple looked at each other, smiling, and walked in. It was then that they realized how difficult it would be to buy lingerie for the well-endowed woman. "Should we just get her crotchless?" asked George as he examined a shelf of panties. "No," said Donna as she lightly punched him on the shoulder. "I like seeing her bulge." George blushed again as the image of the android's inflated crotch came to mind, and he left Donna lead the way through the shop. They bought Brisket several pair of panties, an assortment of enticing bras, and a pair of racy teddies. At the checkout, the clerk noticed that all of the items were sized much larger than the woman buying them. "Do you want to try these on before buying, ma'am?" she asked as she looked at the petite woman. "No, that's okay," she said. "They're not for me." The clerk looked at George with a disgusted expression, and he realized that she thought the clothes were for him. George laughed nervously as the clerk handed the bags full of clothes to him. "Oh, you didn't think the clothes for me," stuttered George, not certain how to explain. Anna grabbed him by the hand and dragged him from the counter. "Come along, Mrs. Luttrell," she said, stifling her laughter and nearly pulling George's arm out of its socket as she pulled him along. On the way home they had a good laugh over the misunderstanding. And how disgusted would the clerk have been if she'd known who the clothes were really for. But there were plenty of people who kept androids for entertainment purposes, so she probably wouldn't have cared. Brisket opened the front door for George and Anna just as they reached the steps, surprising them both. The android had put on the maid's outfit that she'd arrived with, reminding George of their first encounter. He was glad that they'd bought new clothes for her. "Good evening, Mrs. Luttrell." "Good evening, Mr. Luttrell," said Brisket in her most toneless voice. The couple stepped into the foyer, and the blonde robot woman closed the door behind them. "You can just address us as Donna and George, okay?" said Donna, who didn't care for the formal tone. "Good evening, Anna and George," said Brisket in the same empty tone. "Well, that's a bit better, isn't it?" she said to her servant. "If you say so, Mrs. Luttrell," said Brisket. "Didn't I tell you to call me Anna?" "I am programmed to address you as Mrs. Luttrell," explained Brisket. "My default can only be changed at an authorized Exula dealer." "That figures," said Donna to George. "That's probably how they make all of their money, all the little fixes." "We can take care of that later," said George, whose appetite for his wife had been growing since they left the mall. Anna picked up on his tone of voice and looked at him knowingly. Then she remembered an errand they had forgotten to run before coming home. "Oh, shoot," she said. "Could you run out to the grocery store?" George gave her a sad puppy dog look. Anna rolled her eyes and opened the front door as she handed him the shopping list. "Don't worry, hon," she said as she ushered him out the door. "I'll be waiting. And if you pick me up some chocolate ice cream, I'll make it worth your while." Anna gave him her most devastating look, and after drinking her in one more time, George sprinted to the car to get the groceries. Anna laughed to herself as she closed the door and turned back to the foyer. Brisket stood perfectly still, awaiting instruction. "Can't you fidget?" she asked the android, unnerved by her perfect motionlessness. "Yes, ma'am," Brisket replied. Just one more thing they'd have to have reprogrammed, thought Anna. For now, she'd have to settle for redressing her. "Bring these bags upstairs with us," she instructed. "We have a surprise for you." Brisket dutifully grabbed all of the shopping bags and followed Anna up the stairs to the bedroom. As she did, her thought processors scanned the petite woman's body, generating different ways to please her. She envisioned fondling her breasts, eating her sweet pussy, plunging into her warm nest. But each of these thoughts were chased from her mind as soon as they appeared. Anna sensed that Brisket was watching her and thought that it was cute. She'd been told by the dealer that this android model could sometimes become quite attached to its owner, and Anna found it flattering. George used to follow her around the same way when they were younger, but that was a long time ago. Anna sat down on the bed and had Brisket put the bags down on top of the dresser. The android turned to her, solidly still, awaiting instruction. "Why aren't you fidgeting?" asked Anna. "I am programmed to." "Okay, okay. I know," said Anna. How annoying. They'd have to take her back in ASAP. "Please stay in fidget mode for the rest of the day, okay?" "Yes, Mrs. Luttrell. I am capable of day-long commands." "Good," said Donna, who then hopped down and picked up one of the lingerie bags. Turning from Brisket, she grabbed one of the lacy bras and panties and took off their tags. "Are you ready for your surprise?" "Yes, ma'am." Anna turned around, smiling, and held the undergarments out to the fidgeting android, who took them from the petite woman. It was clear by the puzzled look on Brisket's face that the android had no clue that they were for her. "They're for you, silly." "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Luttrell." Brisket continued to stand there with the underwear in her hands. Anna grabbed a sundrace from a bag and held it up for Brisket to see. The android just stared at it. Anna frowned. "Well, you're no fun," she said. She had hoped the android would react like one of her girlfriends would, but then again, she hadn't been programmed that way. Anna felt stupid for thinking that the robot would respond like a human, but decided to explain anyway. When you're given a gift, you're supposed to act happy, she said, handing the sundress to Brisket. The pretty blonde automaton gave a perky smile as she looked down at the dress. "Thank you, Mrs. Luttrell." "Thank you," she said, a little too enthusiastically. Anna laughed, which confused the android, and she frowned. Anna stopped laughing and touched Brisket lightly on one of her pretty cheeks. "I suppose we'll have to program you for this, too," she said, stepping back again. "You see, people give gifts because they like someone. And it's nice when people like you." Brisket still looked confused. "What do you do with a gift?" she asked. "Well, it depends on the gift," said Anna, who took the dress from the blonde's hands. "In this case, you're supposed to wear it. Come here." Anna began to undress Brisket, as if she were a life-size Barbie doll. Pushing her hair away from her back, Anna unzipped the tight black dress. The woman paused when she saw the soft curve of her lower back. She really was stunning, but she didn't seem to be taking the hint on undressing, and instead of instructing her the rest of the way, Anna gently pulled the dress off of Brisket herself. As the dress dropped and her breasts fell free, Brisket felt an electric jolt, and the spicy images returned to her mind. A quick glimpse of the smaller woman falling into her arms, Anna's hands massaging her breasts, Anna's lips around her swollen penis. But her programming quickly suppressed the thoughts, and she remained still. Well, mostly still. The strength of the impulses managed to reach her groin, where her girl meat began to swell up. Anna, too, felt an erotic rush as the dress fell. She faced Brisket's backside, marveling at her strong back and firm ass, beautifully framed in her black panties. And she knew exactly what was inside of those panties. Even from behind her, Anna could see the curve of Brisket's full breasts. She hoped her new bra would fit. Nervously, she reached around Brisket's slim waist to grab the new bra from her hand. As she did, she grazed the firm breasts, and Brisket shuddered. "Relax, girl," said Anna nervously. She grabbed the bra and pulled it back, once again sending the perfect breasts a-higgling. Fire coursed through Brisket's mind, a throbbing agony that screamed for her to follow her instinct. Brisket quickly turned around, startling Donna and causing her to drop the bra and jump back. The blonde android stood before her, trembling, breasts heaving. The black dress was still at her feet, stockings and garter belt on, and her panties were stretched to their elastic limit. Her mouth was open and panting, and her eyes were hungry and pained. It seemed like an invisible force was physically restraining her, and Donna was terrified. Brisket could see the horror in her owner's eyes, and fought to maintain control. "Please ... he be ... afraid," said Brisket, who couldn't bear to be thought of as a monster to this one woman. "I will not hurt you." Her words seemed to have the desired effect, and fear was replaced by pity in Anna's eyes. "I am ... I am okay," said Anna, who no longer felt like she was in any danger. It was clear to her that she had aroused the beautiful creature when undressing her, and that something in her programming had triggered strong desire. As she watched the android's breasts jiggle and glanced at the bulging panties, she began to get a bit excited herself. She couldn't help thinking about how good the girl's cock felt inside of her the night before, the wonderful pressure and stimulation. Brisket's eyes strained at her, arms helplessly frozen at her sides. What harm could it be to have a little fun? She was horny enough to relieve the android and still enjoy some quality time with her husband. "Take off the rest of your clothes," commanded Donna as she herself began to strip. In an instant they stood facing each other naked, woman and servant. Anna fingered herself lightly as she gazed at the 10-inch cock, which looked ready for action. It was time to put it to good use. "Go lay on the bed." Brisket quickly complied, arms again at her sides. Anna crawled onto the bed and looked down at her. Astounding. Leaning down, she kissed Brisket's breasts, causing her to shudder again. It was fun getting her worked up, but she'd have to be quick and finish her before George got home, so she stood up on her knees and positioned herself over Brisket's aching tool. It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood had decided to go to the grocery store at the same time, and even the express lane was backed up. But at last George was on the way home, complete with a half-melted pint of Anna's favorite chocolate ice cream. No matter, he knew that ice cream wasn't what she really wanted, and George was already half-hard in anticipation. Coming through the front door, he tried to guess how Donna would greet him. Once, she had put candles throughout the house, and they made love in every room. Another time, she dressed up as a Catwoman and made him chase her around the house. But as he entered the foyer, there was nothing special about the house, and no sign of Anna. "Honey!" he shouted. No reply. It must be a game. From room to room he went through, expecting Donna to jump out at him at every corner. Nothing. Then he heard a loud thump from the second floor. "Ha!" said George to the empty air, and quickly turned and scampered upstairs. He heard noises coming from the bedroom door, which was closed, and raced down the hall to investigate. MMM. MMM. Oh. 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 Against a wall. Oh no. George reached for the door, but just before he could grip it, wham, something hit against the door, knocking him backwards. Bang. 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 When the door, accompanied by his wife's voice, which stabbed out in a squeaky staccato. Oh exclamation point dot 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 my exclamation point dot 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 God exclamation point dot 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 oh exclamation point dot 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 my exclamation point dot 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 God exclamation point dot 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 change. The banging stopped, there was a pause, and the panting and moaning moved to the middle of the room. George held his breath and opened the bedroom door. The sight before him both turned him on and froze his heart. In front of him on hands and knees was his wife, Anna, completely mounted by the tall blonde android. From his viewing angle, George could see Brisket's thick sausage move in and out of Anna's snatch, which was well stretched and lubricated. Both woman and android had their eyes closed, savoring the sensations. Oh! Oh exclamation point dot 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 over dot 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 on your back. Moving with the grace of familiar lovers, they changed places, and Anna rode herself up and down on the artificial woman she meet. Faster and faster she went, and finally leaning down to finish. That's it dot 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 that's it dot 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 exclamation point dot 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 dot. Ah. Ahhhhhhh. Anna collapsed onto her lover, who tensed up at the same time and released her seed into the petite woman. George at last got over his shock and began applauding. "Bravo! Bravo!" he said snidely. "You really fucked the shit out of that robot." "Shit?" Anna was shaken from her orgasmic haze by the sound of her husband's voice, and she cursed herself. She hadn't meant to go at it with Brisket the way she did, it just sort of happened. She had started out on top, with the intention of making her servant come quickly. But the android stayed hard despite her expert gyrations, and at some point she was consumed by animal lust. As she thought about this, Brisket's now flaccid worm slid out from her cunt, and Anna felt disgusted with herself. She looked down at Brisket and saw that her face was frozen in pleasure, mouth open and tongue lolling out. Her breasts flopped at funny angles. Her hair was tousled. She looked beautiful. Anna stood up and faced her husband, who held her favorite chocolate ice cream in his hand. Melted trails of the dessert dripped from the lid. She felt Brisket's fluids oozing down her legs. George watched the white bead of the cum trickle down Anna's thigh and almost threw up. Anna's eyes struggled to meet his. "You'd better take a shower," said George, looking away. Anna ran past him into the bathroom. As the water began to float, George could hear her start to cry, and he kicked himself for not handling the situation better. He was about to go to her when he saw the delirious android woman stir. "Did you have a good time?" he asked. Brisket considered him for a moment and stood up before answering. Her dangling cock dripped with the combined fluids of her and Anna's fucking. "I fulfilled Mrs. Luttrell's desires," said Brisket truthfully. To George, there were hints of pride and mockery in her voice, and anger began to fill him as he looked at the large-breasted, well-endowed artificial life form. He walked up to her and looked her deep in the eyes. God, she was beautiful. But to George, her bland smile looked like a sneer. and he couldn't shake the image of the creature as it drove into his wife. George reached down and grabbed Brisket's cock, which was now clammy and slick. Starting from the base, he squeezed the meat tube and slid his hand to the head, gathering the fluids. Then he brought the hand up in front of Brisket's face. "Lick it off," he said. Brisket's impulses told her it wasn't a desirable thing to do, but her programming insisted that she obey. She grabbed his hand and one by one licked his fingers dry. George enjoyed watching the lips work, and was getting turned on by the way she sucked. Brisket wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and stood at attention. "My exterior is in need of cleansing," said Brisket. True as it was, George wasn't finished with her. His penis was rock hard now, and since Brisket had rendered his wife useless to him for the night, he would have his pleasure from her. "Oh, but you can't leave me like this," said George, motioning to his erect cock. Brisket took the statement as a command and knelt down to George's waist, and brought a hand up to cup his testicles. "Not like that," said George as he swatted her hand away. Now he walked around behind her, put his arms around her waist, and pulled her up onto her knees. Brisket felt her arms guided down, and found that she was now on all fours. This was new. George looked down at Brisket, whose beautiful ass faced him. He could see her tits swinging from her torso, and her long blonde hair obscured her face. He fell on top of her and reached around to massage her breasts. They were firm and warm, and he felt the nipples harden at his touch. But even though her sensors and processors told her body how to react to his movements, her own mind flashed angry messages which she was powerless to follow. It was clear that the man intended to fuck her up the ass, and she bristled at the idea. Wasn't her cock larger? Hadn't she been instructed to fuck him? Yes. Her cock began to harden, and she started to shift her weight to take control of the man, as she'd been programmed to do. "Oh no you don't," said George, putting his hand on her back. The android froze. "I command you to stay in this position until I am satisfied." Brisket's programming was trumped by this statement, and she stayed in place. Now she felt a large finger sliding along her crack, and a soft thumb press at her anus. The red flag went off in her processors. "Mr. Luttrell, I require lubrication." "Quiet. Anal sex without lubrication will almost certainly cause damage too. I command you to be quiet." That was that. The penis ripped into her artificial flesh. Her programming, processors, and instincts all cried out, but she remained silent. And though the man's tool slid like a hacksaw through her, the real damage was being done to a part of her that her design engineers were aware of but didn't yet fully understand. If Brisket had been born human, she would have understood that the way George was taking her was not right. As it was, her mind struggled to reconcile what was happening to her and, unable to both stop the pain and obey her commands, she shut down. At some point as George plowed into the full pass below him, the anger left his mind, and he realized what he was doing. The experience wasn't particularly pleasurable, and as he looked down at Brisket, he realized that she hadn't moved in any way for a while. He also hadn't noticed that Bunny had finished her shower. "George." Anna looked down at him as if she wasn't certain she knew the man who was perched atop the blonde woman. George withdrew his organ, which had quickly gone soft, and let go of Brisket's hips. The android woman slumped down onto the floor, unmoving. "Oh my God. Brisket." Anna rushed down and took Brisket in her arms. No breath passed through her, and her eyes stared into space. "Anna, I'm sorry. Anna cut him off with a hand gesture, not turning her face from the unmoving Brisket. George's wife began to weep, and he knew that if Bunny had screwed up by fucking the android, he had screwed up worse. Looking back before leaving the room, he saw his wife curled up next to the inert Brisket, weeping into her long blonde hair.